Okay, welcome everybody to this Comparative Education International Development Community event with Jordan Naidoo, a conversation on the SDGs, UNESCO, and the post-2030 world. So my name is Will Smith. I'm the, CEID Community Coordinator here at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm really thrilled to have Jordan join us today. Our structure is pretty simple. So Jordan and I are going to have kind of a moderated discussion for about a half an hour, we hope, and then we're going to have another half an hour or so for question and answers. So as we go along, please write down your questions or add them to the chat, and we'll make sure we get to those towards the end. So now I'm going to stop sharing so you can see two of us. Okay, so I'm excited for today's conversation. I think it's really an important time given the challenges that we're having in the field, the sense that we are 5 years away from the completion of the SDGs, and a lot of the rejections or real extreme challenges we're seeing to global governance, to UNESCO, and to the SDGs. So this is most clearly seen by the actions of the Trump administration in the US, including withdrawing again from UNESCO. The US has been in and out of UNESCO for years and years, attacking the UN at the UN General Assembly, but also specifically talking about the SDGs as a soft governance, globalist approach that pushes a woke ideology, and that the United States rejects and denounces the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So interesting time to talk with one of the real experts on UNESCO, an insider who's got a huge amount of experience. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Jordan Naidoo. So Dr. Naidoo is a global education policy expert with over 25 years of experience in the field. He's held positions at UNESCO, UNICEF, and Save the Children, amongst others. Within the first 5 years of the SDGs, Jordan was the UNESCO Director for SDG Education Support and Coordination, which makes him uniquely positioned to discuss the relationship between UNESCO and the SDGs. As the inaugural director, he played a pivotal role in shaping and negotiating the global education agenda under the SDGs. Building on his earlier leadership at UNICEF, he co-led UN efforts on the post-2015 development agenda. He was central to drafting of the Incheon Declaration and the 2030 Education Framework for Action, embedding principles of equity, inclusion, and lifelong learning into SDG 4. So Jordan, I've had about 10 years of learning from you in UNESCO and what the work was like. So I'm thrilled that you can join us today and share some of your thoughts and experiences. Welcome and thanks for joining.
Thank you very much, Will, and thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to speak with you and then to continue the conversation with your students and colleagues, as well as those online. I think before we go on to the exchanges, I just want to make an opening statement, a short, brief statement, especially since you raised the issue of where we are, both relative to the SDGs, but I think more importantly and more concerning with the changes in terms of global governance and the whole issue of global cooperation under threat, given the current situation, particularly coming from the US. I think, as you said, I was quite involved in the process both in the lead up to the adoption of the goals, the formulation of SDG 4, and then the initial rollout of the goals, which I think for me was a moment of optimism. And 10 years on, it's really a bit of I think pain in some senses that we've hardly achieved much of what we've set out to do, and there's such a short time left. And I'll come back to that, and I hope we can talk about that more. But I think, in terms of global governance, what's important is that we cannot think of global governance purely from an institutional, structural perspective. I think we really have to think of it in terms of shared purpose and negotiated legitimacy. And this is really, I think, what the SDGs were about. The sustainable goals. Really, those of us knew from the outset that it depended less on formal institutions and more on cultivating a shared purpose across nations, across communities, and across different stakeholders. And I think to some extent we've lost sight of that, and we can come back to that issue we focused much more on structures, and even though the monitoring and indicators are important, we seem to have paid a lot of attention on those aspects without achieving much. We still do not have indicators and measurements for many of the targets across the board. So I think we can come back to that. But I also want to make another statement. When we did adopt the SDGs, it was, a culmination in some ways of the Education for All movement. The Education for All had, started with such optimism first in Jomtien and then picked up again in Dhaka in 2000. And there was a powerful conviction underlying EFA, and that conviction was that multilateral cooperation could advance education universally. And I think to some extent, the SDGs was building off that conviction, but with the taking account some of the lessons from EFA of some of the things we needed to do differently, and particularly the fact that we needed to move beyond simply access. So I think that was a key. I will come back to the kind of optimism that was felt in my position, both at UNICEF when we were doing the consultations, and then as I moved in early 2015 from UNICEF to UNESCO in Paris. But before moving on, I just also want to say something briefly of my current situation. Having retired from UNESCO first in 2020 and then going back for a year and finally, breaking ties formally again in 2023, I'm now spending at least one semester, 4 months in Shanghai. At the UNESCO Teacher Education Center Category 2 Institute based at Shanghai Normal University. And I think my experience last year and then following the second semester this year, where I'll be here till January and then we'll return one more time in 2026, gives me a different vantage point. In terms of both the SDGs, but also the changing nature of global governance. And perhaps we can talk about that towards the end when we look at what's next for the SDGs or what's next for development and global governance more generally. So over to you again, Will.
Thanks, Jordan. I think you brought up a little preview of where I hope the conversation goes. And I want to start with some of that kind of initial optimism, but you also mentioned legitimacy. So when you think about the build up to the SDGs, right, for about 3 years before the SDGs that were agreed upon, there were a range of different stakeholder meetings, proposing various goals, and we had different international organizations participating in those. Wondering about UNESCO's role specifically, given that UNESCO has been had the original mandate for education following World War II, but also had been challenged over the years as the leader in education. So what was their role in that creation of the SDGs? And importantly, why do you think UNESCO's participation in the creation of the SDGs, or how do you think it impacted the legitimacy of UNESCO as a global leader?
I think, thank you, Will. I think that's a good starting question to kind of situate UNESCO's role. I'm also glad that you raised the point that to some extent, UNESCO was under threat in terms of its leadership in education, and its kind of leadership role had been progressively undermined and eroded to some extent. There was a lot of things going on, I think, from about 2010, the MDGs and the lead up to 2015. So to some extent, the SDGs and we can talk about UNESCO's leadership in hosting, together with the Republic of Korea, the Incheon World Education Forum, was a critical turning point for UNESCO in reclaiming some of that legitimacy and leadership. I think there were a number of things that happened in those 4 or 5 years that kind of, in a way, eroded some of UNESCO's leadership. Part of it was some of UNESCO's own doing in terms of the way it operated and perceptions about it becoming too political, the bureaucracy of UNESCO, the decision making, in terms of its governance processes and so on, clouded things. The second, I think, perhaps beyond UNESCO, was the closure of EFA and how it sort of ended. Countries were having to do these national reports, but there were some questions about the value of those reports as we were leading up to the end of EFA. And there were a lot of issues about the focus on primary and then increasingly higher levels of education, but the focus on access and the need to move beyond. And there was some feeling that UNESCO had not kind of adapted enough or brought countries along to make changes in terms of EFA. Then I think the positioning of different both UN entities as well as other players challenged UNESCO in the lead up. One big change was in UNICEF. I spent those preceding years at UNICEF and I saw that. For many years, UNICEF was largely, in terms of education, associated with child-friendly schools. The school in a box, its human rights approach, but was very much seen as being a kind of delivery of services, particularly in vulnerable and crisis situations. But I think post-2020, 2010, UNICEF increasingly became involved in policy. The shift had happened to a great extent in UNICEF's work in health. It was playing a bigger role in Gavi, in partnerships with World Health Organization, WHO, and in the same form, the UNICEF leadership was requesting that UNICEF education also pivot towards playing both the service delivery role, but being more involved in policy. And there was a significant shift, particularly around advancing the equity goals. So that was one thing that influenced the situation. I think another big influence was the role of the World Bank, doing both the big projects, but World Bank also defining policies and having the year of ministers of education and finance. And I think this also complicated things for UNESCO. A third big, I think, influence was the increasing role and growth of GPE. GPE, in its formulation, had grown substantially from its formation formally from the shift from FTI to GPE was a significant impact on UNESCO. And both in terms of its footprint financially, but also in terms of its technical growth. In pure numbers, GPE moved from a staff of about, below 15 to almost 100 by the time the SDGs were adopted. And I think by now that number's doubled. So that was a big shift and an influence. And then finally, a few other things going on at the same time, the tensions around the Global Education First initiative, the role of Gordon Brown, and the Education Commission coming on board. And particularly, I think the Education Commission report played a significant part. So UNESCO was in a strange way struggling to redefine both its policy role, its leadership role, and its mandate in education. And I think to some extent, the discussions at a management level between the ADG, Mr. Tang, for UNESCO, and I think it's Geeta Rao Gupta, the Deputy Executive Director for UNICEF, responsible for education. I think the individual sort of cooperation, saying, we have a moment where we need to work together to put education on the SDG agenda. And I think one important detail that, information that's often ignored, in the early days of the consultations around 2013, there was even talk of education not having its separate goal. In a discussion that Olaf Sem, my predecessor at UNESCO, and I had with the chief economist of the World Bank, at that point, there was quite a strong position that education should not be a separate goal. It should be integrated in all of the other goals that it's linked to. However, quite a few of us within the education circles felt this would be a disaster for education because it just gets swallowed up and would not receive the attention, both financially and otherwise. So that changed the dynamic. And so I think UNESCO then invested a lot of effort in the preparation. And as it was the co-lead for Jeffy, the discussions with Korea gave it an opportunity to propose hosting the World Education Forum, which in a way really ensured that UNESCO, in partnership with UNICEF to some extent and the World Bank, would lead in the SDG formulation. Let me
Thanks,
stop
Jordan.
there. I have a lot more to say, but we can go through some of the things I've raised.
I want to ask a short follow-up. So you mentioned kind of the rise of different actors and a lot of different voices in there. And in the past, you've written about how the negotiation of the SDGs is really one of the most inclusive consultations in UN history. With all these different voices, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how did they collaborate? Were there, how do we get along with this? What did that inclusive collaboration or process of negotiation look like for you?
I think what really helped, there was a lot of tension because there were clear positions at that during those 18 months or so regarding some of the priorities. Clearly, one position was we needed to pay more attention to, learning. And so there was a big push to focus on learning, given some of the key donor positions, the work in the US around EGRA and early grades assessment. There was a lot of push to focus very much on being able to assess literacy and numeracy in the early grades as a key indicator for learning, even before the targets and goals were being discussed. The second big issue that was surfacing, or it had gone on for a while, but really came to a head, was around privatization. There was an increase in the number of private schools, new actors, particularly in Africa, and a lot of discussion around GP funding of private schools. So even in GP board discussions, this became an issue. And then from civil society actors, both from the teacher unions, but a number of NGOs involved in, raising questions about public funding of private entities became an issue. But I think what brought things together, in a sense, there was a realization that despite the differences and despite the priorities that different stakeholders had, there was an opportunity to have a broad education agenda. And so I think to some extent that kind of was a big tent approach. Despite differences, the opportunity for the education community to define the targets was something that they looked forward to. Why this was important, I think, to some extent, for some of the other sectoral areas, UNDP and other UN agencies, UNDP and DESA, the Department of Social Affairs, played a very much more hands-on role. But for education, because of EFA, because of the Jeffy initiative, and because there was already plans towards the World Education Forum, that process of consultation and defining the goals was left very much to UNESCO and UNICEF. So that, I think, helped a lot. That's the first point. Secondly, I think what also made a difference was that in the consultations, there was this series of kind of end of EFA consultations that happened. So in that process, you had these various regional meetings from Bangkok to Argentina to Nairobi, which allowed multiple stakeholders to sit around the table and discuss. Then the third point, I think, despite a lot of criticisms of the EFA steering committee, which in a way became the basis for the first SDG steering committee. That platform, with some actors who'd been in the process for a long time, but also new actors, allowed for a platform where there could be some very honest, some acrimonious discussions, but it was a platform which allowed for some resolution and consensus building. And I know, even for WEF and for some of the regional declarations that came out of the meetings, they went on to early parts of the morning. But eventually, everybody kind of were committed to consensus. So there were a number of compromises along the way amongst all parties. And I think that sense of consensus building has begun, well, pretty soon after began to erode. And we see quite a bit of it lost already.
Thanks, Jordan. I think you've done a good job of helping us understand a bit of the challenges, the different voices, what might have brought the different voices together. And then in 2015, we have the Incheon World Education Forum. And I think leading up to that, I think you're transitioning into your role at UNESCO. So wondering if you can talk a little bit about your role as that inaugural director for UNESCO's Division for Education 2030. Obviously, this put you in a really key leadership space for the SDGs. Can you share a bit on what you're doing in that position, what some of these challenges are, maybe some of them that spilled over from the pre-SDG conversations, especially in that kind of first few years of your role?
Sure. Before I move on to that role, I just want to say one more thing about the year before, the 2014, 2015, and just before I moved to Paris as the director in April of 2015. The whole consultation process, I think, is undervalued. In terms of the global consultations, both the meetings as well as the online consultations, which fed into the overall UN report on the world we want. That was an important process because it really showed that some of the UN agents could work together, particularly UNESCO and UNICEF. So that, in a way, already in the build-up to the World Education Forum, for about 10 months before, there was constant back and forth, visits from officials from UNESCO in Paris to New York and vice versa, to ensure that we were on the same page. So when I moved, it was a secondment from UNICEF because I was already, my predecessor, Olaf Sem, had gone back to Norway. So the ADG, Mr. Tang, was having to cover some of Olaf's responsibilities, which was impossible. So for a time, I covered both in the technical working group and so on, represented both UNESCO and UNICEF. And this is one thing I want to add before I go on. Remember, the open working group was a political structure. Then you also had the eminent eminent panel. But supporting that was the TST, which was technical. The different agencies were represented on the technical working group, and that provided for education. Fortunately, our inputs largely from the UN side came from the preparations for the World Education Forum, and then finally from the World Education Forum Declaration. So that, for me, the transition to UNESCO was quite easy. From at a personal level, many people said you're moving from a, very agile kind of delivery-focused institution to a bureaucratic institution. I think it was somewhat seamless. The biggest challenge was having to have a much smaller budget. with a team that was twice the size, and with the responsibilities that was global and much bigger, I think I had 1/10 the budget that I had in UNICEF at UNESCO. So just to go to the work as the director, one primary responsibility was the coordination role, to help roll out both the SDGs, but also because the practical implementation of the targets was outlined in the Agenda 2030 document that came out of WEF. So in many ways, the responsibility at UNESCO was to ensure that the elements of that Agenda 2030 document could be translated as practical guidance for countries and for regions. And that would be done. One way was through the regional meetings that would be hosted to monitor. So in a way, from the outset, there was this preparation of the schedule of meetings that would be held both regionally, and also the first GEM, Global Education Meeting, for the first formal reporting at the HLPF in 2019. So that there was this target in terms of how would we coordinate the inputs on reporting for the first round. That was one responsibility. The second, we all recognize that, with the multiple targets, 7 plus those subsidiary targets, it would be one primary responsibility was to the development of the indicators, because the UN Statistical Division had left some of it, they took on themselves, but for those sectors that were leading the work, they left it to the sector to propose indicators. So one function was working with Sylvia Montoya, the UIS director, who represented both represented the UN agencies and the community such in the UN stats discussions. We formed a working group on indicators, a technical working group, which Sylvia and I co-chaired with representatives. I think there were 30 representatives distributed across each of the UNESCO regions, as well as civil society representation, I think academic and other stakeholders. And that process continued, for quite a while. I think there were some successes where there was some agreement, and also, as you would know, the coordination with the Global Education Monitoring Report in terms of how reporting would go to them and their role also in support for the development of indicators. So that was a big part of it. The third part of it was, to continue the advocacy, to work on communication and other materials to ensure the SDG framework was taken forward. One of the things that, really, I think I was glad of, it gave me the opportunity to go to many of the regional meetings, even country level SDG meetings. And, I think in the first year or two, there was a real sense of enthusiasm. Countries worked both within sectors, but also often at national planning directorates to select and prioritize certain targets relative to their own context. So, when I moved on from a Paris position to Afghanistan, I saw quite clearly even a country like Afghanistan had a very detailed SDG plan, which included, prioritization of 3 of the targets. But some other countries as well, from many of the Nordic countries and then countries like Kenya, were very well organized in terms of reporting on the indicators, on the targets. So that was a big role. But in addition to the SDG coordination, the directorate was quite a big directorate. It included, a section on the teacher task force. So there was a lot of technical work around that. There was also a section on gender. And I think what was really, I think, interesting in the first few years is that many of the other two directorates played quite a significant role in providing technical inputs to the documents and policy briefs and so on that were coordinated and produced by the SDG directorate. So one thing that I think came out of the SDGs is that different directorates worked more closely than I think before. Whether that, sustained, I don't know. The other challenge that I perceived, there were some attempts to work across divisions in UNESCO. There were initial discussions with the social sector and with the science sector, but they did not develop very further. And for me, that's also one of the disappointments. I think around with the social science sector, there was some progress, particularly around the work on youth and youth engagement.
Thanks, Jordan. I want to kind of combine a couple questions here. So you've talked about some of the enthusiasm, especially early, kind of aspirational nature and the excitement at the beginning of the SDGs. We know the SDGs are very ambitious in what they hope to undertake, but we also know that we're a ways off track of meeting the SDGs with 5 years to go. So I'm wondering if you can help share a little bit. So for instance, in 2025, the UN Sustainable Development Goals report said that only 15% of education targets are on track to be met by 2030. So going from the excitement, ambition, enthusiasm, motivation at the beginning to what looks like we're going to be falling well short, can you help us understand a little bit from your perspective on why do you think we're going to be so short on that, and what role might, the overambition be, or other factors?
Yeah, thanks for raising the 2025 report. I actually went back to look at it and to look at, their rating of each of the targets and even within each sector. And it was interesting, looking at their assessment that, in education, at least the first three are stagnation. There's a couple, as I pointed out, the data challenges, they're not reporting on skills for employment, and adult literacy. And then we also have the issue of, some of them even regression. If we look at the teacher target, it's actually gone backward. And this is really disappointing. I think to some extent, some of the stagnation and lack of progress is not unexpected, given the scale of the challenge, right? I think in terms of teachers, it's a historical problem that's been exacerbated by new challenges as well. So that's something we should have expected. The point you made, I think for many of us, right at the outset, there were warnings that we are being too ambitious. And the explanation was, yes, well, we know that some of the targets are aspirational and we will not be able to reach them. I think a mistake in terms of the way we communicated and didn't have a better plan about staggering some of the objectives in terms of timed milestones. And there was some discussion about that, both in terms of having milestones that would be time-bound or attached to certain time limits, as well as having disaggregated regional benchmarks. And I think, Manos and the GMR has done a lot more work on benchmarking and trying to do, those, even the attempt at using the spotlight reports and so on to try to capture both challenges, but also progress that may be more nationally and regionally achieved. So I think some of those issues, we did not give enough thought about the implementation and how we would actually measure. So looking forward, and maybe that's I'm going to some of your questions, if we were to continue another round of whatever we call the goals, we need to look at tiered targets. We need to look at time-bound targets for different targets. And maybe the point is, I think the mistake we made again was that there were far too many targets. If we look at 169 across the uh, uh, 17 goals, that's far too many. But having said that, I think we were also reacting against the MDG process. Remember that the MDGs had been formulated and written up by a group of experts in the basement of the UN building in New York. It was far more limited. It was far more technocratic in approach. But even they did not receive, reach all of the targets set. I think the SDGs, despite all of the issues we have had and are still having, did give the opportunity for the consultation. It was open. It allowed for multiple voices. I think the mistake was the promising too much, right? So, and then we've had to deal with conditions that we didn't expect. I think the whole, even while we may not have achieved everything, the change in the global aid structure, the challenges to governance and so on, has put everything even more at risk. Even where we had a chance of achieving more, that's falling away. So I think if the momentum from around 2018, post-COVID, if we had some optimism rebuilding, we could have achieved more. But and then we have to take some of the crises into account. Definitely, COVID has had a significant impact on many countries in terms of their ability to reach even some of the minimum targets. Then I think the last year or so, in terms of the crises, the conflict, that has also ensured that even regions with some chance of achieving many more goal of the targets, that's not going to happen, both particularly in parts of Africa, and we know in the Middle East. So I think some of those things. But despite that, I think the other problem is in a development framework with the scope and scale of the SDGs, the biggest mistake perhaps was that the time frame. 15 years is far too short to expect to achieve those targets. Particularly, the big targets, not only in education, if we think of climate, peace, the others, but within education as well. Clearly, the employment, those linked to employment, to skills, and so on, are impossible to achieve within such a short time frame. And then I think also what is the divisions that started to get bigger after 2017, 2018 also have contributed to it. Particular stakeholder interest ensured that we didn't have a consolidated approach to the targets. I think while it's very important to pay attention to foundational skills and literacy and numeracy, but the sustained focus on just that, resulted at less attention to a holistic approach. So some of that contributed. However, there's also some, positives. I'm thinking about in terms of global governance, the coalition that was formed post-COVID. That has endured. There's been more sharing around that and so on. So, there's some contradictions in the way the SDGs have played out, where we've had these divisions being, reinforced, but at the same time, we see areas of cooperation. So on the whole, I think from the main lesson is going forward, if we have to report globally, I think we have to limit ourselves to perhaps 3 targets that would be globally reported. And then other targets have to be more contextualized, either through some kind of regional benchmarking, or we come up with different configurations of countries at the same level of education development, where they set, collectively set some targets that may be achieved through cooperation within a block of countries.
Excellent. Thanks,
I
Jordan.
don't
I think
know. Now I'm starting to think aloud. So
yeah, no.
I,
It sounds similar to some of what I've been thinking for the kind of post-SDG era as well, as far as having kind of almost menu of regional goals or targeted goals that individuals would sign up for, and having a few foundational goals beyond just literacy and numeracy. So since you've got us there, let's get to our last question, which is really just an opportunity to expand a little bit more on what you think is going to happen at the end of the SDGs. So in the post-2030 world, the SDGs will supposedly end in 2030. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, will we even have another round of global goals given the current climate? Will UNESCO's role and be, and what you mentioned a couple of ideas as far as kind of maybe having 3 goals with maybe more regional cooperation and flexibility. So continue to do some thinking aloud for us. What do you think is going to be the post-2030 world?
I think, despite all the challenges to multilateralism, whatever reformulation, architecture, processes come up, I think there's still enough recognition and sense of cooperation amongst many in the world still that, particularly if we think about the climate challenges, the crises and so on, collective action is still needed. So I think there's still despite all of the, the conservative pushback against cooperation, I think there's still a feeling, substantial majority realize that international cooperation is necessary, both for global progress, equity, and so on, but also that the challenges we face now and going forward affect everyone. Solutions that are, very singular and focused only on internal national interests will not help even those nations who are moving in that direction. There has to be collective action on many of the challenges that we all face together. So I think at a fundamental level, there will be reform to the architecture, but the idea of global cooperation will endure. How and in what form is still something up in the air. But I think, from past experience, we know that there will not be something completely new. There has to be a starting point, but there will be multiple, I think, kind of blocks of cooperation. I'm thinking about, in some ways, to still use old terms of North and South and South-South, but there will be more South-South sort of configurations. The current efforts from China through the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS initiatives, and so on, will, I think, become more formalized and expand more, particularly around shared resources and shared expertise around technology. I think that's, we're already seeing a lot of it happening right now. And that's likely to provide other platforms for cooperation besides the traditional bilateral and multilateral arrangements. So that, I think, also something that will affect any future joint global development goals. That's one. What else can I say? And I think for education, to some extent, despite the disruptions that technology and artificial intelligence will cause, may actually, in a perverse way, drive some of the both the desire and the need for cooperation. Because in some cases it's leading to the divide and inequities and so on, but at the same time it may provide opportunities for fostering equity and more common sharing of that expertise. So that's something, because I think particularly in terms of AI and the potential disruption of economies and changing, both causing labor shortages or disrupting the labor market, requiring new skills and so on, that may force cooperation to some extent, because everybody may be equally affected by some of the negatives that may arise.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jordan. I know we've got probably lots more to talk about, but I want to thank you for going through the conversation with me and open it up to any others that have questions in the room. So I'm going to peek my head over to who's in the room, but also online. So please feel free to add any questions you have for Jordan to the chat, and we'll try to get through those. So, from the room. Questions. All right, hold on a second. I'm going to make sure you introduce yourself. Okay, so that's for you.
Hi, Dr. Naidoo. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciated this talk. It really helps to contextualize our studies and like real world applications. So thank you so much for being here.
Who are you? Who are you?
Oh, sorry. My name is Maddie. I am, a master's student here. I'm curious about the implementation of the SDGs in terms of localization and wondering what you've seen at the stakeholder table in terms of, you mentioned UNICEF, like the change of delivery assistance to like policy in 2010, and that kind of abrupt shift. So I'm curious what you're seeing, is like localization being actualized? Like, is it true like power redistribution, or is it merely just a shift of responsibility without any acknowledgement of like who actually is in charge of making these policy decisions?
I think, there's no one consistent trend with regard to localization. You've seen some areas where localization has been really authentic and has happened in a way where the country and even, at lower decentralized levels, they have assumed a role in terms of trying to implement the SDGs in a way that makes sense to their local context. But in other cases, we've seen, cookie cutter approaches where everything has been decided or implemented largely depending on who is providing the support, either from a bilateral agency, a UN agency, or even a national or international NGO. So it varies quite a bit. And it also varies relative to the subsector and the thematic area in education. To give us an example, one thing I think where there has been little contextualization is around the curriculum relative to whether we talk about, all of the multiple issues in 4.7 or in terms of the content related areas of quality for ECD or primary and secondary education. We are seeing many more, particularly in the last 3 years, the whole issue of competency-based curriculum, right? The competency-based curriculum spread, it seemed to be very much reflecting the same technocratic, consultant-driven language across countries. So in a way, I think the curriculum changes that are happening, even where they're speaking about, addressing issues of climate challenge and so on, it seems to be a uniform approach. We have large projects being supported by different donors, including GPE, around ESD. But the application of the ESD frameworks seem to be, uniform, driven from particular agencies or particular countries. And again, another example I can give is the focus on STEM in many countries, particularly again where less developed countries are trying to mirror what may be happening on STEM in more developed countries. So this issue, I think, for me, by and large, localization may happen at a framework level, saying, we are selecting these three targets as our priority. But when it goes down to the implementation and interpretation of those targets, it's very much coming from a top-down external perspective. There are, and I don't want to insult those who are consciously and seriously doing localization, but by and large, it's not happening in many cases.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Other questions online or in the room? So that's your opportunity. Hold on a second. Come on over here to.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm on the CEID program. And my question is that you mentioned two of the main issues in the rollout of the SDG is that there was mistaken promising too much and giving too short a time frame for this. But I was wondering, this seems to reflect to me like the dominant narrative that a lot needs to be done in not a lot of time. And I was wondering how that issue is approached in the UNESCO board and in these organizations in developing the new SDGs.
Well, it's difficult for me to really discuss that because I haven't attended a board meeting for a number of years now. So I'm not sure what the new thinking is about how to go forward. But let me just reflect. I think one of the other things that happened besides the fact that we've had not enough financial commitment, clearly there was much more money needed, both in terms of, international investment, but for countries. Many of the countries have not, while some of them have moved towards that, 4 to 6% recommendation around GDP in terms of national budget. Many are not meeting that 20 to 25%. So clearly that's one issue that has to be addressed. And by and large, it's about how the funding is used for social services relative to other needs, whether it's defense or other things that are seen as more important. That's one. But in terms of going forward, I think what UNESCO board and so on will do, I am not exactly sure. The big thing, I think, in the last few years, and another thing that I think has kind of undermined the SDGs to an extent, is that we've tended to focus on certain issues along the way and then had big global conferences around that issue, which has taken away from some of the central messages of the SDG. To give as an example, a few years ago, again, UNESCO and partners recognizing that there's not enough, the pace of progress was too slow and there was not enough change in education systems. There was this big Transformation Education Summit. I think that Transformation Education Summit in the moment seemed to create some enthusiasm, but I'm afraid the transformation language, really wasn't really taken forward in practice. It became for me very symbolic, a buzzword, and took away attention from the core direction of the SDGs. And similarly, we've had, other global conferences like that, focusing on either on a subsector or a particular issue without looking at the need to approach the SDGs in a more holistic fashion. We had the global conference on ECD. Fine, it put some light on the ECD challenge that still most countries are not spending enough on ECD. Many countries are not even meeting the minimum target of 1 year of preschool. So that was there. But, once the conference is over, it seems to be that the issue is only taken by a small community within the larger community that's interested in early childhood. Similarly, earlier this year, we had the global conference or summit on teachers. Out of the Transformation Education Summit, we had a high-level panel on teachers. Now we have teachers. If you look at many of the discussions, all responsibility and expectation of success in turning around the challenges is teachers are the solution, and some people are saying it's a problem. So this approach of piecemeal approach to the SDGs, I think, also complicates it. So looking forward, I'm hoping, as you know, the point earlier made with Will, hopefully at a global level, maybe we choose three significant issues. We choose teachers, curriculum, or whatever the issue may be, and maybe globally work on that. And then whatever sub-issues we need to focus as part of the whole needs to be contextualized regionally or some other configuration of commonalities between countries, either level of development, level of investment, or other ways that they can face the common challenge together. I think going forward, we cannot adopt a kind of global approach to every issue in education. We may have 2 or 3 key global issues that have to be handled, at least from a policy direction level. We need to have a much more nuanced implementation planning approach at different levels.
Okay. Thanks, Jordan. I think we've got a question online. So, Ali, do you want to jump on, or do you want me to read that out?
Hi, I can jump in. Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Naidoo. Thank you so much for your presentation and for sharing your experience of being there in the process of building this entire movement that happened to drive everybody mad, I think. But my question is, as I explained, is that when you were discussing about the role of the different actors interacting with each other and making a lot of commitments towards the goals and the specific targets, you mentioned that, or it gave me the impression that you said that UNESCO and UNICEF, they ended up with the leadership of the education goals because of the other processes that were happening at the same time. For instance, the EFA, or just for instance, the EFA, that there were different actors that were committed to other policies as well. So it sounded a little bit it was by chance, but I wonder if, reflecting back, could there be any other actors that could have done that? Do you see any other potential competitors or co-leaders that could take over?
I think to some extent, maybe I gave the wrong impression. I'm not sure purely by chance or default that these two took the lead. To some extent, UNESCO within the UN family is kind of, at least from UNESCO's position, they would argue they are the mandated organization to lead education. Education's in their title. And for UNICEF, on the other hand, was seen largely as the children's organization working in almost all sectors. But I think in terms of UNICEF, over time, the expansion to some extent happened very quickly to play multiple roles, purely from a service delivery role to also a policy implementation and planning role, for a number of reasons. But I think a lot of the changes that happened were due to who had the most money. And to some extent, the funding for UNESCO for UNICEF increased quite a bit in those years around between 2005 to 2015, where they had a lot more project funding, they had a lot more dedicated funding from some big bilateral donors, from Scandinavia, from other parts of Europe, substantial funding on certain issues in education. In one case, UNICEF had a project for 200 million to focus on post-crisis situations, on peace education and so on. So that also gave UNICEF a new global leadership role together with UNESCO. Other players clearly, there was expansion, and I think the formal platforms, but they did play a leadership role in many ways, maybe in terms of thought leadership in defining some of the policy. The World Bank played a significant role in defining some of the targets, in a lot of the technical backroom discussion. But more directly, I think they played a bigger role in the countries themselves through their project funding, as well as through their direct loan funding to those countries. So they also influence some of the priorities in country relative to the different targets. There were also other changes happening. I think the OECD, for example, was beginning to play a much bigger role at a global level beyond the OECD countries through the expansion of PISA. So that also, I think, affected how the SDGs were being interpreted and what the countries were then prioritizing. You had many other countries joining PISA, but you also had, I think, between 2014 and 2016, OECD trying to expand PISA by launching PISA for Development, where they had selected 7 less developed countries to implement PISA. So you found different actors playing some leadership role, but not necessarily in the formal coordination, but through influencing what would be taken up as a priority. Similarly, I think for me, one of the biggest players in it all, both in a formal coordination way, but also influencing policies directly, has been GPE. Yeah. Because countries that receive assistance through GPE are required as a condition to have an education sector plan, and often some of the guidance that is given is directly by GPE staff or through consultants supported by GPE. They've changed the model a little, where now GPE expects a partnership compact to be developed in country. Often that partnership compact is highly influenced by GPE staff or a consultant who may be hired through GPE funding. So we see, I think, the influence of different actors in different ways. On the global agenda, both, I think, within SDGs and outside, today, the focus on foundational learning, led by the Gates Foundation in large measure, but also supported by World Bank, UNICEF, and others, is now focusing, making sure that becomes a priority. Is that going to be at the expense of countries paying attention to some of the other targets? Possible.
Right. So given this web of network and everything that emerged out of the SDGs, can we be safe to think that it's not possible not to have goals after 2030? Is it inevitable that we will have to have goals?
I think, no, nothing's inevitable, but it's a toss-up. It could go either way. I think it depends. For me, I think from personal level, I think the goal is to give some kind of structure, some coherence to it. But we have to be, in a sense, we can set some aspirational goals, but those kind of have to be at a very high level with not necessarily very stringent reporting requirements. But we have to have at a more practical level something that's much more nuanced to different contexts, rather than expecting everybody to report on singular aspirational goals.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, Jordan. We've got a couple other questions online, and then I'm going to give one other opportunity to the room before we wrap up here. So I'm going to combine these two questions from John and Susan, because they're both looking at what's next. So specifically, Susan's wondering about kind of this global approach to development and nationalism, and whether or not the movement towards nationalism risks the credibility, and whether we might see lower sign up to whatever the next round of global architecture looks like. And similarly, or kind of more on the content side, John's asking about this shift that we saw in the SDGs to, some people talk about it as like access in learning or access in quality, away from the MDGs access only. And do we think that there's going to be this shift in a post-2030 world to focus just on quality, or should we continue to try, or will we continue to try to look at both access and quality? So some more thinking about what's going to happen after the SDGs.
Yeah, I think to come back to start with the second part of the question, I think given the, just the data showing that there's like 270 million children out of school and so on, we have to continue to focus on both access and quality. But I think we have to ask a little more deeply, access to what? Because, in terms of the way we've looked at the access, and even as I said, 270 million out of school, given the technological changes and so on, and depending on the time frame for the next goals, if we have global goals, the nature and the kind of the way we define schools and access may change somewhat, right? Because we still very much on the industrial model of schooling, where we have buildings with kids sitting in the classroom, even if they are now using, tablets and laptops and so on. But by and large, it's the same model of schooling. Is it going to change? As some people claim, AI will revolutionize education. So we still have 5 years. In 5 years, will we have to think of a different model of access? And then are we going to have to redefine quality? Yes, despite my criticism of the over focus on foundational skills, I still think we will need those foundational skills, right? But we will need to broaden what we mean by those foundational skills. So in terms of that, I think there has to be some shifts of how we are defining both access and quality. In terms of whether we will have global goals or not, that's hard to say. I think, I know there's been a call from UNESCO on little short think pieces about the SDGs and the future and global governance. And just reflecting on the experience here in China and, the kind of cooperation that's increasing between China and many of countries in Africa in particular. There's multiple projects all over the place funded through the Belt and Road Initiative. Is that going to be the basis for some other kind of global governance or regional cooperation? I think also thinking about it from that respect, and we spoke about it earlier, all of the existing partnerships, for example, ASEAN and so on, or the Latin American partnerships and so on, can that become the basis of some kind of broader structures that, instead of having everything through a centralized UN type organization, can we have more regional entities being formed and cooperate among regional blocks? That may be something that may evolve to bridge this issue between national and global, where regional entities find more in common. But I think the one thing that will sort of affect what happens further with regard to global governance is what happens in terms of migration and mobility. Given the situation, I think despite attempts to stop people moving, that will continue, and that will ensure, in some ways, make it necessary for us to have some kind of continuing global governance structures, noting that those structures have to be adaptable. I think
Thanks,
just
George.
as there's this, reaction on the right of trying to stop all forms of migration, on the other side, there will be recognition that migration is part of the way of life today, and it adds value as well. So if there's kind of a meeting between the two ends, there's a possibility of having some kind of more softer, responsive global governance.
Thanks, Jordan. I think we've got 2 more questions from the room, and then we're going to wrap up. So we'll take them both
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, thank you for facilitating this encounter. My name is Estefania. I'm also a CEID student. And my question is regarding the indicators. So we've been seeing in loads of the texts that we've been seeing on the courses that one of the biggest problems to assess whether the SDGs were successful or not are the indicators that usually, or not usually, but for many of the cases don't match the target that's supposed to be measuring. And I was wondering if you think there's a way that there can be a way to bridge that gap, either by modifying the goals to match the indicators or to develop new indicators. And even though you're not working in that area anymore, if you think that in the future, that's going to be something that's going to be taken into account. Thank you.
Okay, so let's get
Yeah.
the second. Jordan, you
Okay,
want to
go
answer that
ahead.
first, or take the second one? Okay, so let's get the second one here as well.
Hi, my name is Corinne. Thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. It's been really incredible to learn from you. Kind of going along this idea of changing the system, I am wondering if there's been any conversations about completely inverting and like scratching the goals entirely for 2030, seeing that only 15% of the goals were completed, and kind of creating a new system that would be more bottom up. So like creating space in these big global areas like UNESCO and UNICEF that would allow for regional partnerships or like south to south collaboration to create their own goals. So like kind of having UNESCO be the ones that are, I don't know, perhaps creating a stage-gated implementation process that would therefore help and create agency with each of these South goals, right? As you were saying, in the regional context, it's very different of what they're both looking for. And so then the people could have more agency and say and what they would like to see changed, which would maybe change the system. Thank you.
Let me start with the second question. I'm not sure what the discussions are within, the different organizations. I'm sure, as it had happened with the SDGs, the discussions began quite early. So I expect there must be at different levels, both, from management, but also the technical staff. But there's been a lot being written by different academics, professionals, practitioners around that question. So the discussion is starting about, whether we will have global goals, should we have them, and if we do, what form should they take, given our experience and learnings from SDGs? And then there are other positions, as you've just said, where alternatives are being suggested, and you will get on the other end of the spectrum, people saying, no, we shouldn't have any of these. They don't contribute much. But my general sense is that we may land somewhere in the middle, where there may be some kind of global framework with some key goals, and then this disaggregation and reporting and goals that are more national and regional. I think the goals in terms of the global ones may be at a higher level in terms of, fewer with to give some kind of impetus to global cooperation on the primary challenges. That's what I think may be a practical solution. And then, regional goals for Africa, for example, led by the AU or as for example. In terms of the other question with indicators, I think the lesson is we needed to have thought more about how we are going to measure. Especially, on the quality goals, and the 4.2 or 4.1, I forget now, whichever one is the one on learning, is the clear example, because months and even almost 2 years were spent to try to establish some kind of coordination where we would use existing testing and try to look at some coordination and benchmarking across different tests to be able to do some comparison. But I don't think they've reached agreement, and that work has continued endlessly. So I think the question is that if there is to be global goals in the future, people will give a lot more attention to trying to figure out at least some indicators and means of measurement from the outset, rather than leaving it to agreeing on the goals first and then trying to come up with the measurement. I think they will have to, the lesson will be, we would have to try to work concurrently. So when and if any framework is adopted, there are a set of accompanying measurement indicators. So, the one thing to stop to look at on a positive note, I think on some of the education indicators, particularly on equity, while the equity patterns are changing, there has been progress. I think many more countries we've achieved a lot more in terms of girls, both enrollment and performance. However, in other countries, we're seeing a reversal of gains on the side of boys. But at least on the equity goals, there have been more progress than was expected. So maybe with more efforts on some of the others, we can make progress even in this short time that's left. Not to achieve the, unrealistic targets, but at least to get quite far towards them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jordan, for joining us today and sharing your experiences, sharing especially around some of the optimism and enthusiasm at the beginning of this, some of the challenges, and then I appreciate your kind of increased, or I guess, continuing glimmer of hope in this era for the post-2030 world. So very much appreciated there. Thank you so much for taking time to join us from China. I think we're going to wrap it up now. So if you're joining us, we're the Comparative Education International Development community here at Moray House at the University of Edinburgh. Please do follow us on LinkedIn and join us at our other events. So Jordan, thanks so much. And I'm sure we'll continue our conversations on global governance and post-2030 world in the future. Really appreciate you joining us today. If the room can kind of join me in just thanking Jordan for taking his time today.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Will, to you and everyone there in Edinburgh and online. It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks, Jordan. Have a great day.
Okay, bye.